Okay, so we're gonna move a little bit away from the vegetable garden, but still staying with edibles. So it's time to entertain some of these fruit questions that we had rolling in. And I think this is a great time of year to address some of these issues. But I know, Greg, we had two questions that were related to cedar apple rust and apple trees and so you want to talk us through that, and I'll share some of the pictures. We had one picture that was kind of fuzzy, another that was really, really clear. But one of the questions, like one was just general, is this cedar apple rust? And then the other one was a little more comparison. So they have a 3-year-old Freedom apple that appears to have cedar apple rust, they think. They have nearby Liberty apples that seem to be unaffected. So they're wondering, they also don't have any cedar trees in sight on their property. And they're wondering if do they need to go ahead and treat with fungicides? Can they save this plant? What is the process moving forward once you think that you may have cedar apple rust? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
So on those, cedar apple rust is a very common issue for all home gardeners. I would tell you cultivar selection, use the resistant varieties on those. The cultivar that we're talking about in question actually does have some cedar apple rust um, resistance. Now, I don't believe this one is
You're
that is
right. That's the
truly,
wrong one.
that
Yep.
one was truly cedar apple rust. Cedar apple rust is going to have a true orange halo and a black pimple right in the center of that. It is telltale. It's a very common disease and very easy to identify. And so you can see the orange halos over here and the little spot in the middle. So typical cedar apple rust, controlled through fungicide sprays. And the biggest problem that most people make is they wait till they see the damage on the leaves at this point and they try treatment. And when actually that treatment needs to be before the bloom period that we're getting those initial sprays on to cover and kind of protect those leaves. And it's before petal, before bloom, and then as the petals, are pretty much at the end of that petal fall, and then our first cover sprays. Those are the critical times to control those. And our home fruit spray guide really does a good job of mapping those out, and that's how you control it. Whether you can see a cedar or not, chances are there's a cedar somewhere in the facility that's serving as the alternate host for that plant during the winter time. So cedar apple rust. The other image, Celeste, that they brought up there, very hard to tell, but I'm pretty confident that is not cedar apple rust. And to be honest, looking at it, and when I enlarged the images, they got blurred to a point I couldn't tell what they were. But I actually think that's black rot. This particular cultivar is resistant to apple scab. That's another very common uh, disease pathogen in apple trees. This cultivar is resistant to apple scab, not so much to black rot. And the fact that we've been so wet this spring that
Mhm.
if you really weren't on a good spray regimen, the potential for fungal diseases are going to be, um, they're just going to be there. And so follow that spray schedule, start out early in terms of your control, be consistent with that control throughout the growing season. And our home fruit guide really kind of maps that out. Two things I would tell you: timing prior to those wet periods, and secondly, good coverage. You got to get good coverage to get good protection. Remember, fungicide doesn't necessarily kill fungus. It is merely a barrier spray, and I equate that to putting sunscreen on and going out into the sun to protect yourself. Same as good coverage on apple tree to protect it from fungal pathogens.
That's a good analogy, Greg, too. And sometimes I miss those sunscreen spots, and then you got to get good coverage there. So you got to make contact and completely cover that entire plant there too. It's very important. And then also I did drop a link in terms of which chemicals during that spray schedule that Greg was talking about there. So be sure if you are interested in that. And we had a question come in about this specifically for cedar apple rust. A lot of times removal of the galls on the, cedar trees is helpful, or removing the cedar trees and other cultural practices there. But if you are looking for a chemical fungicide to utilize, I believe Immunox is the product to utilize for that. Best time to spray, starting on that cover, kind of what Greg was talking about. The timing of that spray is critical. So I believe our control recommendations are just before the bloom opens, that pink stage for apples. So feel free to look at that chart. It's just easy to walk through the best times to spray there.
One last thing, though, to remember: read, follow, label.
Ah,
Read,
yes.
follow, label. Immunox is one that has a long withdrawal period. And so it's a great fungicide, great for protection, but it has a long post harvest interval. So if you're using it in apple trees or if you're using it in grapes, we generally use it early in the season because of that long residual period. And then we switch over to Captan, which has a much shorter post harvest withdrawal period. So read that, understand that's critical on those for food safety, and also doing a good job protecting those plants.
Yeah.
We actually had a question that just came in the chat, which this is very good timing to talk about, which was a question about time of day. Now, she was asking about tomatoes and peppers, but this is, fine. It's a good discussion for the tree fruits as well. And so I think earlier when I was talking, I made a reference to planning to spray this evening. And it's one of those things where there's not necessarily a wrong answer. It kind of depends upon the exact timing and your weather conditions. So our goal is to be spraying at a time of day when we do not have maximum heat load, a lot of bright sunlight. So we want our, leaves to not be, like partially wilted because they've had moisture stress or something like that. So if you're gonna spray in the evening, make sure that it's later, make sure that the plants aren't moisture stressed, and make sure that there's enough time for those leaves to dry before you head into the night. So lots of times people prefer early in the morning, so that you can make sure that the leaves get dry if you can have a nice calm period. So, I'll just be honest, I'm not really much of a 6 a.m. person. So I try to hit that end of the evening window. And if you had an 80-degree day, it's pretty easy to hit that window. If you had a 95-degree day, sometimes those evening, windows get harder to hit. But anybody else can toss
Yeah,
in their
Natalie.
opinion if I miss anything
And
there.
to throw a shout out for our wonderful pollinators, right? Our bees. They like to go out in their foraging events to get that nectar and pollen when that sun is at its peak there. So to Natalie's point too, that's the hottest point of the day, right? So to reduce risk for bees, native bees and honeybees, beekeeping and whatnot, when applying fungicides during the bloom period, that is when those bees are visiting, there is still research that's going on about how that affects, but especially with copper products for fungicides, and especially any that have a mix of an insecticide in that as well. Definitely best to apply those products during the late evening, night, or early morning if you're a morning person. So making sure that it's not when the bees are foraging.
Yeah, two things from that standpoint too. With those, wind is always a biggie. And so staying away from drift, and also like Seth says, watching the pollinators and when their activity is, sometimes getting those two together can be challenging. And lastly, the only thing, particularly in these apples, that we're going to be spraying is streptomycin for fire blight. And if we've done a good job with their cultivars, maybe we don't even have fire blight. And our good management keeping that pruned out so we can stay away from even having to spray during that bloom period.
We do have time for one more. I skipped one question that was back into the fruit section, and it was talking about blackberry vines, bushes, and they're having some issues with grass and weeds all around the base of these plants. And they're wondering, they're realizing that there are advantages and drawbacks to different types of mulches, whether that's an organic mulch or if you try to put some fabric down around there. But what are y'all's suggestions? This particular question submitter said they're back really hurts, and they just need some help on this weed and grass situation. So, what are some options that homeowners have for keeping those spaces under their bushes clean, or should they even worry about it?
So the one thing and Natalie can address this here in just a second because she's experienced this in their trial plots down in Middle Tennessee. Barrier, that'd be my first recommend. Use a barrier. Plastic first would be my suggestion. Landscape fabric would be my second. Plastic is going to do a good job in terms of conserving moisture, suppressing weeds. If I'm not mistaken, Natalie, you all did this with the blueberries after the fact, or maybe with the blackberries, came in and put down a cover. You know, with blackberries and blueberries, they're so shallow rooting. I tell people stay away from using weed suppressants. Yes, there are some that commercial people will use, and there are things like trifluralin, preen that might work for some of your grasses. But I would tell homeowners use a barrier, and then what few weeds that come in holes, pull those out.
Awesome.
Yeah, I completely concur. And this is one of those things where I can say with all, with all honesty, we tried it both ways. We planted a brand new planting of blueberries in April, and the Bermuda had just nearly overrun our young plants by August. And so I had, some fun 95-degree rescue applications of ground cover. So we've done it both ways, but planting we use woven ground cover a lot because it's durable over the course of time, and we have some that have irrigation on top, some that have irrigation underneath, so it depends on your volts or what damage issues you might be looking at there. But yeah, for the blueberries and the blackberries, I would say that, I mean, there's some cons, right? But I think the pros outweigh it.
A couple of things that on this image that I told them that two things I would do: really kind of beef that trellis system up, get the canes up more erect. Think about tip pruning when we get them up to that 4 or 5 foot height, whatever we like to pick at. Pinch those terminal buds so we can get the lateral branching. You can exponentially increase your fruit production by good tip pruning and also reducing that vegetation, putting more energy into the plant. I think you could certainly increase the production you get out of your blackberries.
And it'll be easier to control those weeds if we can get those canes up and growing in the fashion that you described, they're going to be able to more confidently, whether it's just like weed eating or doing something to keep a lot of that vegetation down, they'll be able to see that more clearly. So, certainly.
Yeah, and it kind of forces you with your management to kind of count your canes and really stay within that planting area. So this is a up close picture of one of our blackberries, but you can see, yes, we have an older cane. We also, that's a floor cane that's currently fruiting, and then a couple of young primo canes there. And is there a weed? Well, yeah, there's a couple coming through the planting hole, but those are much more manageable.
Okay, awesome.